For those of you who haven't visited with us before, I'm Father Matthew Thurman. I'm the priest and pastor here at St. Luke the Evangelist. A little history on this presentation. This presentation, which is in 4 parts, I've done a couple of times in the past. There was probably about a decade ago a very active Orthodox Christian student group at Hiram College. And being the closest parish and the closest priest, I actually went and met with those students on a regular basis. They all graduated, and I never heard about anyone Orthodox coming back to Hiram College. I don't know if that's a reflection on Hiram or not. But I also did a version of this in the parish, and that also was about 10 years ago. And I actually managed to expand this out from 4 sessions to more like 8 sessions. So I really spent like 2 full sessions on each of these topics. So the challenge I had this go around was stick to 4 and don't go crazy here. So just kind of the idea behind this lecture series. The main focus is to talk about our faith as Orthodox Christians and really put it on the map in terms of what a number of folks might have outside of the church as reference points for the Orthodox Church. So most folks don't know a lot about the Orthodox Church, but they kind of latch on to certain words or certain things that they've experienced. So a lot of this is really going through terms, defining them, explaining them in terms of how we as the Orthodox Church understand them. I think for most of us, we, broadly speaking, have a reference point and understanding of what Protestant Christianity looks like in all of its various forms. And of course, we also have a general reference point of, broadly speaking, what the Roman Catholic Church looks like and what that's about. So, just as a reminder, the topics we'll look at in this series are, we're Jewish, we're not Jewish. Sorry, that's kind of the whole point of the first part of this lecture. We're not Jewish, but we are Orthodox. We're not Roman, but we are Catholic. We're not Protestant, but the Bible came from us. And we're not denominational, we're pre-denominational. So the idea is that we'll spend 1 session on each of those terms. And I do understand that as I present, it may bring questions, and there may be things that go to some of these other topics. That's fine. We can address those when we get to the questions. Now, of course, what we can find in presentations like this, it's a compare and contrast. So we may have this certain understanding of a term or what the Orthodox Church looks like from the outside, but this is in terms of how we understand it as Orthodox Christians. Or part of it's the compare and contrast. The Protestant Church, broadly speaking, may look at things this way, compare and contrast with how the Orthodox Church looks at it. I know that sometimes in presentations like this, the compare and contrast can take a challenging approach. I know that there are some Orthodox priests and Orthodox churches where it's very much we rule, everyone else not so much, and that's the approach that they take in their presentation. I want to do more that Irenic compare and contrast here. But that being said, of course, we have distinctives as Orthodox Christians, and part of my job as an Orthodox priest is to say this is what we believe. So that may contrast or differ with what other Christians believe. But of course, I'm just trying to do that more in that objective compare and contrast, as opposed to kind of going back and forth and butting heads against one another, so to speak. So let's start in. And I'll say it very carefully this time. We're not Jewish, but we are Orthodox. Now, Orthodox is a term that we often run into and may associate specifically with Judaism, and especially here living in Cleveland. There's a large Jewish community here in Cleveland. It always astounds me because I don't I haven't had this experience elsewhere, but there are occasions when I go through, I might be running errands on a Saturday morning, and there are certain parts of Beechwood that are very, very heavily Jewish, and of course, Saturday morning is the Sabbath day. And so it always blows my mind that I can go through Chagrin Falls, there's people out and about doing their thing, go up to Beechwood, and to me it looks like a ghost town. It's the Sabbath day, so they're not out and about, and if they are out and about, they're at the synagogue. So that's something that we see and something that we normally associate here. We might hear Orthodox, we think Judaism. Let's look at that a little bit. Now, an experience from that sense of someone might hear Orthodox and think Jewish reminds me of a story. And this is something that has happened to me, and I've heard from other Orthodox priests that they've had similar experiences. So this was several years ago. I was at an event in Chagrin Falls. I'm not sure if it was like Chamber of Commerce, but it was like local community leaders. So church folks, business folks, and I was being introduced to a businesswoman. And so here's Father Matthew Thurman. He's the pastor at St. Luke Orthodox Church. So think of that, the introduction. St. Luke, author of the third gospel, Christian figure. Pastor, Christian leaders are often called a pastor. And from St. Luke, the Evangelist, Orthodox Church. Church, specifically. And I was dressed, kind of in the street version of this. So I had the collar on. I think I had just a blazer, but kind of the standard quote-unquote uniform for being in the public. And the woman looked a little lost and confused after the introduction. I was trying to have, just kind of that, I just met, who are you, kind of your typical chit-chat in those sorts of circumstances. So after a little bit of her not looking all that comfortable, looking a little confused, she asked me, "Are you a rabbi?" And of course, I was just, all the things I just listed. It's like, well, no, I'm not a rabbi. So in all of that, the only word she heard was Orthodox, and she associated the word with Judaism. So there's a problem there. Some folks hear the word Orthodox, and it directly goes to Judaism. Well, how does the word Orthodox get used within the context specifically of Judaism? Spoiler: it's not a Jewish word. It's actually Orthodox. It's a Greek word. So you kind of see the direction this is going. But I looked, because of course it is used within Judaism, and so it was, how is it used? Why is it used? Where did that come from? And I found this reference. There's a book called The Jewish Religion, A Companion, and the author is Rabbi Louis Jacobs. And so he explains in there about the use of the word Orthodox. So this is a quote from him. The actual term Orthodox is derived from Christian theology. I knew that. And was, at first, a term of reproach hurled against Jewish traditionalists by early Jewish reformers at the beginning of the 19th century, to imply that those who failed to respond to the modernist challenge were hidebound. So basically it was an insult. You Orthodox Jews who are kind of stuck in the mud, was the language. So continuing the quote here. Eventually, however, the term was used by the traditionalists themselves as a convenient shorthand for the attitude of complete loyalty to the Jewish past, although some traditionalists prefer the term Torah true to describe their religious position. In any event, orthodoxy, within Judaism, came to mean for Jews faithfulness to the practices of Judaism in its traditional formulation. So a key thing to see here. The term Orthodox, as I've already looked at, was borrowed from Christianity to be used within Judaism. And this happened only within the last 200 years. So it was not something, it's not part of something that's gone on in the Jewish tradition for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's relatively new. Now, I think part of the difficulty, and part of the difficulty that came about as a part of this conversation with this businesswoman that I met, and of course this is a much bigger topic and conversation. Here in the United States, we don't do a really good job of talking about and presenting religion in general. I know that there's the thing about we have freedom of religion, freedom from an established religion by the government, but often that gets stuck in the sense of, well, we shouldn't talk about religion at all because we don't want to step on anyone's toes. But I think what helps in these conversations is if you have had some sort of robust look at other world religions just from the standpoint of knowing what they are and what they actually teach, and in the language and the way that they present themselves. Of course, part of the difficulty often in compare and contrast conversations is that you can take, here's my position, and then take the position of the other and present it as a caricature. So I often have this conversation with our teens when I'm talking with them. If you're ever questioning something about another belief or practice, look at the belief or practice as it's presented by the folks that actually believe it and practice it, because you want a fair comparison there. Again, speaking of distinctives and commitments, I also make the point to the teens, I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe this stuff was true. And it took a while for me to get to the point where I'm here. So I think there can be a compare and contrast, and in the sense, we end up where we are because we believe it's true. Now, to help with that sort of conversation, and I know this is a bit of a digression, there are two resources. When I tend to teach, I tend to summarize and just kind of present things. But when I teach, there is actually reading and thinking that goes behind this. So this is actually a book I read as a freshman in college. And I occasionally look back and see, are there better presentations of this? It's a book. The author's name is Huston Smith. It's called The World's Religions. And it basically goes chapter by chapter, and it says, okay, Christianity. What does Christianity believe? Islam, what does Islam believe? Judaism, what do they believe? So this is kind of your generic comparative religion. It gives you that good basic factual about all the different world religions, something to look at. And then the next thing, and this is probably more helpful to the folks that are part of our church, the Orthodox Church, is this book. It's called Seeds of the Word, Orthodox Thinking on Other Religions. This is written by priest Father John Garvey. And so how he presents this, it's similar to Huston Smith. So he'll say, here's Judaism, but he'll do the compare and contrast in there. Judaism, Orthodox Christianity. And then he looks at some of these other things about, well, what about contemporary understandings in other religions about interfaith conversation, and what is our approach as Orthodox Christians to interfaith religions. This is a digression within a digression. Then I'll bounce back here to the main point here. Within conversations about interfaith, which is Christians speaking with non-Christian religions, that is not handled on the local level, as it were. So me as a parish priest, it's above my pay grade is the presentation. So there are people at our national church who are involved with those sorts of things. So I cannot participate in interfaith activities. That's one thing. Ecumenical activities, so that's Christians with other Christians. That's something that I can participate in, and I have participated in, and we're actually actively encouraged, participate in your local, ecumenical Christian group. So I've done that in the past. A friction that came up is our current local group. They've they have gone in the neighborhood of interfaith conversations or on moral issues or statements that are different from what's possible from our church. So I've actually backed off on some of those conversations and participations. And it's not about being mad at anyone, and it's not about, lighting the torch and running around the neighborhood, as it were. It's recognizing the limitations of what I'm allowed to do as a pastor of an Orthodox church and just acting accordingly. So, digression within the digression. So we'll come back to the word Orthodox. So we've looked at Orthodox within the context of Judaism. And I think probably the main conclusion we can look at this, and I think we all understand, is we understand Judaism is a distinct, different religion from Christianity. I think, and I hope everyone understands that there's, even though there's a common background, there is, common text, Old Testament, as we would call it, Hebrew scriptures, or I know Torah is not the complete Old Testament, but common texts there. But we understand that there's a difference, and that kind of the theological ramifications and what it means in terms of practice are different. So I think we understand that. But let's look at that word Orthodox again. And does it occur elsewhere within discussions about religion? Interestingly enough, it is used often within Protestantism. Of course, we understand that the Protestant church is not one monolithic thing, but there are denominations. We'll look at that in one of the later talks. And just a whole scope of denominations, non-denominational churches, more conservative churches, less conservative churches. And that's typically where this use of Orthodox will come along. And so it will often be, the word Orthodox will be invoked by Protestants who may be in a denomination where they have a disagreement with how, and there are ways of presenting it. It's that the denomination is not traditional enough. That's probably the nicer, fairer way to put it. And so it's saying it needs to be more traditional, more conservative in terms of belief and practice. And so you will have that within denominations. So people will say, well, I'm a member of this particular denomination, but I'm Orthodox in my belief. I hearken back to the more traditional things and not so much on what's the mainstream of the denomination. And it can even go in the direction of actually leaving a particular denomination and starting a new one. There's an example here. It's not as common, but back in the 1930s, there was this mainline denomination, Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, PCUSA. Up the street is one of their churches, just across from Giant Eagle. But back in the 1930s, there was a group of folks that weren't happy with theologically where the denomination was going. They said it wasn't conservative and traditional enough, and they left, and they started something called the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So it's this Orthodox to modify the word Presbyterian. So that's something that we can see within the Protestant church. And often, and I think this is kind of a wave in our direction as the Orthodox Church, they'll say, we're small O Orthodox. We're not the big O like those guys over there. And so I think there's a sense of, because they are invoking more the traditional approach, that they see us as traditional and say, well, we're not them. We don't want to steal that from them, but we have this Orthodox small O belief. So, Judaism, Protestant church. I'm going to get to the kind of the last part of the first part of my presentation tonight. But before I do that, any questions or comments? I know that I can kind of get on a roll and I need to rehydrate a little. So if there are questions or a comment at this point between sips. Okay. Well, I'll keep moving. So how do we, as the Orthodox Church, capital T, capital O, capital C, the Orthodox Church, understand and use that word, orthodox? And this gets at that meaning that we saw. The Protestant groups invoke it with a certain understanding, and what we heard in terms of that definition and use within Judaism. So here's a source by, his name is Reverend Leonidas Kontos. It's a nice Greek priest here. And this is a little bit at the etymology. The term orthodox combines the adjectives orthos, which means right, correct, or true, and the noun doxa, which comes before the verb doxazo, I hold an opinion, or I believe, and so together, hence, right belief, or true doctrine. But in a deeper sense, it also means right worship, since doxazo can also mean I glorify. And you'll even hear this in the terminology in Western churches, a doxology. Well, it's giving glory to God, right worship to God. So, how we understand it is it's this idea of true worship and belief. They go together. And it's a descriptive adjective. For our faith, we have an orthodox faith, one of true belief, one of true worship. It also applies to us as adherents to that belief, and for what our church as a whole is. So it's saying that our church as a whole functions as a right-believing, right-worshiping church. So it does follow in that similar vein that we saw within the use in Judaism or in that Protestant instance. It's recognizing that our doctrine, worship, and values really don't alter over time. As I've alluded to in that definition, we don't make a sharp distinction between worship and belief. One of the big things that we will tell people who are interested in the Orthodox Church is it's all fine and good to read the books. There's a lot of good information in the books. But what you really need to do to understand our faith is to come worship with us. Because, and you can kind of see it here, how we have the church set up and what's in here and what we actually do on Sunday says a lot about what we believe. And often, in preparing someone to enter the church, I might tell someone, I'll say, okay, you've read enough books. It's not about reading the books. It's more about what you're doing to participate in the worship and spiritual life of the church. So I'll steer them in that direction. Let's see if I have anything more on that. I think that point's wrapped up here. Well, this last part is, it looks more at this idea of orthodox and how we understand it in a different sense than you would find within the Judaism or within the Protestant use. So this is distinctives. So we may say, and that you may hear this language elsewhere, we equate Orthodox with the Christian faith as it was originally handed down from Christ and the apostles. That's a good statement there. It's the faith of the apostles. It's the apostolic faith. Now, other groups may make that claim, but the difference is, in a Western context, it tends to be in a propositional sense. And by that, I mean, in Western churches, it may be point 1, we agree on this doctrinal statement. Point 2, we agree on this doctrinal statement. Point 3, we agree on this doctrinal statement. So you could fill those in. Trinity, incarnation, what have you. Now the difference is, for us, we don't simply see it as a list of propositions. We probably can have a conversation and agree on a number of those things. But the difference when we say it is the Christian faith as was originally handed down from Christ and the apostles, It is this more fundamental claim, and it can be a bold claim, and it can be provocative for some people to say that this church is the church that Christ and the apostles founded. On our bulletin, we stick a quote on there. The disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. That's from Acts of the Apostles. And it's making the point that the bishop who ordained me was ordained by a bishop before him in this line that goes all the way back to Antioch, to Peter and Paul and the founding of that church. So it's saying that it's a continuation of that church and really that family, as it were. So within that, we may have all these statements about what we believe, but it's saying that that family of belief has continued up to today. So it is different, and sometimes that throws people. So they want to go to the propositional thing. Well, I agree on this point. Well, let's talk about the relationship part here. So that's orthodox as a term. It's the first half. So the next way of looking at the word orthodox, it's not so much about the Judaism piece, but often, and this is actually fairly typical, and I'm sure some of my parishioners have had this, that the reference point in talking about their faith as Orthodox Christians can go off the rails here. You say, well, I'm an Orthodox Christian. And you share that with someone who is not Orthodox and may not have an experience of the Orthodox Church. And you'll get asked, well, what kind of Orthodox are you? Are you Russian Orthodox? Are you Greek Orthodox? Are you Ukrainian Orthodox? And in a sense, we can talk about that, and in a sense, there is some legitimacy with that, but it switches very much to this ethnic, cultural focus. So the difficulty there is, then it gets into this conversation about, let me back off on that for a moment. So it may be the sort of thing where the experience of the person asking that question is, this is another great thing about living in Cleveland with 30 plus Orthodox churches, is during the summertime, on a given weekend, there is probably a church festival at an Orthodox church somewhere. So I know that for us, one of the closest parishes is St. Constantine Helen in Cleveland Heights. And at the end of August every year, they have their festival, Thursday through Sunday, 4 days. And so that the experience a lot of people have is they'll go, they'll hear the music, they'll see the dancing, they'll have all of the food and the baklava, and they're always good about saying there's a tour of the church and you can come in and we'll talk about our faith so you can understand who we are. I've gone on those tours, and proportionally, it's like 100 to 1. For every one person who's in the church on the tour, there's probably another 100 outside enjoying all the food. So the reference point does tend to be all of the cultural things, the language, the dancing, the food, and all of that. And it doesn't get into the conversation about, well, what do we believe? And if we wanted to talk about what we believe in comparison with a Protestant church or a Catholic church. Well, part of what muddies this too is being able to talk about those ethnic cultural distinctives, because they are there. And this is one of the difficulties that we have as an Orthodox church in a North American context. But let me put it to you this way, and kind of the oddity for us to hear that question. What kind of Orthodox are you? And I have an example here. And I did write this 10 years ago, but I used Lutherans. So I know we have some Lutheran guests with us. So say you're a Lutheran and you present yourself to someone. I'm a Lutheran. I go to a Lutheran church. Are you ever asked, what kind of Lutheran are you? Are you German? Are you Danish? Are you Finnish Lutheran? Historically, there's probably a reason and some legitimacy for asking that question. But is your concept of yourself as a Lutheran primarily about an ethnic term or not? Probably not. All right, I will bring up the monkey wrench, and I will talk about the ethnic piece here. So part of why we do have those distinctives here in North America, because you can go in Cleveland and you can look on the signs, you can look on our sign, and it'll say things like St. Constantine Helen, Greek Orthodox Cathedral, St. Vladimir's, Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral. Our church, it's a little different. St. Luke the Evangelist, Antiochian Orthodox Church. One difference, Antiochian talks about the bishop we're ultimately under. Antiochian is not actually an ethnicity, although because it's in the Middle East, you will find people of Middle Eastern background within our archdiocese. Well, it has to do with how churches came here, and it has to do with how churches have or have not developed. So some of those terms, so if we were talking about, Finnish Lutherans or German Lutherans, if you were looking 100, 200 years ago, that is how a lot of those churches came here. It was in ethnic groups. Even in the Catholic Church, you can think about it. We see this less now, but it used to be much more prevalent here in Cleveland, where you would know that's an Italian Catholic parish, that's an Irish Catholic parish, that's a Hungarian Catholic parish. But the understanding is they're all Catholic parishes. And so the focal point is more about what does it mean to be a Catholic and what's the language there. And of course, now at this point, it is more about if you're Catholic, you just go to your local parish. And the ethnic piece is not that big there. Now, where it's off the rails is with the Orthodox Church. So we had the similar pattern where whoever came over started their churches. So Ukrainians came over. They started Ukrainian Orthodox churches. Greeks came over. They started Greek Orthodox churches. On and on and on and on. And the problem is there's still a relationship to some extent with the church in the country that people came from. And unlike the Catholic Church, the reference point's the Vatican. There's one reference point. And from the Vatican, the Pope can say, well, this is what we need to do as Catholics and all come together. So at this point in North America, there are 16 different Orthodox churches. And the only difference is who started them and how they're being run now. But it is the sort of thing where anyone from Ukraine, and we know this, anyone from a Ukrainian Orthodox church can come here and worship with us. If I was invited by your priest to go and serve there, of course we'd have to talk with the bishops a little bit, and that's a phone call, but there's nothing preventing me from serving over there under the right conditions. It's not a difference of faith. So the way to think of it, and this is the crazy-making thing, is it would be like, I'll go with the Catholic analogy here. We have one Catholic church in the United States. What if there were 16 different Catholic churches, all in the same territory, but one is run by one group of people, one is run by another? It gets very confusing. But they all believe the same, if they would all believe the same thing. It's just administratively, there's 16 different things going on there. So part of the difficulty, and some even go to the extent of saying that part of the scandal is, well, all 16 of those churches should just be one church. And in that, there's still a way to pastorally work with people who have different ethnic backgrounds. But you wouldn't have all this duplication. So you wouldn't have like your Christian education thing. There would be one Christian ed thing, not 16 different departments and 16 different churches, as an example. Now, a little take on this and a little spin on this too that's different is with that tie between churches here and churches in the old country, as we often hear, is that a lot of traditionally Orthodox countries over the past 20 to 30 years have been having a lot of difficulty. If you think Syria, for example, our archdiocese, as I mentioned, here in North America, is under the Bishop of Antioch, and Syria is part of his territory. And so there are people who have fled Syria So there's a large influx of Arab-speaking Syrian Orthodox, and they need a church. So, of course, the churches that they go to, there is more Arabic used. Typically, the priest speaks Arabic. That's a real pastoral need. That being said, a church like ours, which is part of the same archdiocese here in Bainbridge, Ohio, where the vast majority of our parishioners are native English speakers and we don't have refugees, we do things in English, and it tends to look more like a Bainbridge, Ohio expression of Orthodox Christianity. But that's a reality. So unlike a number of these other churches, there are Orthodox Christians who are not native English speakers, not culturally native, that's going to sound wrong, Native American, not in that sense, native to America. Like us who are I was born in Colorado and I've never left the United States. That distinction sort of thing. So there's still that need there. But we do have that difficulty as well. So just looking at that, as I've said, when we talk about ourselves as Orthodox Christians, you can have that conversation. What kind of Orthodox? Meaning, and probably the way to say it is, I see the word Antiochian on the sign. What does that mean here? Or your sign says Ukrainian. Tell me about that. And it often can get into, well, this, and it's a good conversation. This is the nature of the parish and who goes here and some of the history, and so you can kind of understand what that's about. But the conversation should also go directly to, well, who's Jesus Christ? What's our relationship with him? And how do we live that out within our local parish? So that's what I have for tonight. So at this time, in earnest, and I could call on people. If you have questions, I would much enjoy questions. So I'll turn it over to all of you. Yes, Michael.
Yes. Thank you, Paul. You intrigued me at the beginning, stating about comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share with us 3 examples of comparing the Orthodox Jewish faith compared to ours? They say this, we believe this.
So I could do in general Judaism. So a few things. New Testament. So we, as Orthodox Christians, understand the New Testament as, as the language says, a new statement from God about our faith. And of course, it focuses on Jesus Christ. And that's a second point. We can talk about Jesus Christ and how within Judaism it's understood. So Jesus Christ, as we understand it, Son of God, God incarnate, the Messiah, Savior of the world. We can use all of those words. Judaism does not. And so they're like, nice carpenter's son, kind of got ahead of himself and ended up in trouble, and the Romans, got himself killed. So a very different understanding of who Jesus Christ is. So that would be one. And so in terms of what's said, because there is all of this that's written about Jesus Christ, which is the New Testament, for Jews, they would say, well, because we don't believe that, that's not one of our sacred books. We don't look at that. That's 2. I got to come up with a 3rd. I was on a roll here. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe the way to do this, and the 3rd distinctive would be looking at the Old Testament. So for Jews and Judaism, because that is their book and the totality of their book, everything that they need is within that. And so they will look at that. For us, we look back in that direction, saying everything in there is pointing towards Jesus and this expectation of Jesus. So they would not have that there. So it's a different understanding of the book itself.
They're still waiting for the Messiah.
Yes, they're still waiting. Yeah. And waiting, yeah. So.
Already enough sweetness.
So, Tyler.
Is this an ancient way of referring to the Orthodox Church, or is this a more modern construction to divide the Western Church from the East? Is that, what is Eastern Orthodox?
So, talking about Eastern Orthodoxy, that is something more of a historic term. And some of the language that can be used there. So if we're looking at Christianity back, I'll go 1,000 years. So if we're looking about 1000 AD, right around the time when there was the East-West split. That kind of gives you an idea. So you had, the church in Rome, the Western churches under the Pope, splitting from the Eastern churches, which were, the four other. Let me back a bit. So there were like five patriarchates, ancient sees. Rome was one, that was the Western one. And then the four in the East: Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. And so the separation there. And so the convenient thing on that was to talk about churches of the East, the four, as opposed to the churches of the West, Rome. And then another distinctive on that, and you'll occasionally see this, and these are more old-fashioned terms, talking about the Latin church as opposed to the Greek church. And I know that gets confusing because we talk about today Greek churches and festivals and all that. But it's a similar sort of thing, because the dominant language, kind of the theological language 1,000 years ago, churches of the East, was Greek. So those four churches, they were the Greek church, the Church of the East. And of course, in the West, it was Latin. So they talk about the Church of the West and Latin in the West. So what you'll often find is, if you find books talking about that period of church history and Catholic Church, Orthodox Church from, say, 100 years ago, they will use language like that. The Latin Church as opposed to the Greek Church, the Church of the West as opposed to the churches of the East, sort of thing. But today, I think that's the trick. We have the internet. So everybody talks to everybody, and kind of those geographical things don't matter so much. So we tend to rely these days more on just talking about the Orthodox Church, and not so much. I know there are some churches that still do that we're an Eastern Orthodox Church. Might even put it on their sign or their newsletter or their letterhead. That's kind of older language. Yeah.
So when did the first person call themselves an Orthodox Christian? Like, was it around the schism? Like, when did that term? Because originally everyone was just Christian.
Yes.
Right. So when were there the first Orthodox?
So I tried to pin that down, and I couldn't find an exact. Like the thing with Judaism was very exact. It's like early 19th century. You could find the finger pointing and the use of the word Orthodox, but it would be consistent with using it after the schism, because again, at that point, it is saying we're distinct from those guys, and was very contentious. So it would be like, well, and I think that's the thing. It's like, well, we're the Roman Catholics, and we would be like, well, we're the Orthodox, and you'll see language like that. We're the Orthodox Catholics. That's the next lecture, the Catholic one. So
this might be jumping the queue, but then how did the folks in the Western Church respond to Orthodoxy becoming the descriptor for the Eastern Church, when the people in the Western Church were like, no, we're the right, true, worshiping, believing people. How did you win that rock paper scissors match? Keep Orthodoxy.
It depends on who you talk to. So, it is that sort of thing where, again, the language of distinctives and who is using the language. I actually had this encounter with someone at one point. It's kind of an odd story, but I had this is our first summer here. So I took my wife to the airport. She left on a trip with the boys, and on my way home, I got in a car accident. It was a very scary car accident. And the woman that I had the accident with was a middle-aged Roman Catholic woman, and we kind of freaked out because we both didn't die in this accident. It was a scary accident. And she was telling me, she's like, I just got off work. I was actually on my way to Mass, and what's your story? And I'm like, well, I'm an Orthodox priest. And she's like, what's that? And I kind of gave her the thumbnail and said, well, we're the church that goes back to the apostles, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she says, well, that's what we are. So it really is. So there are ways of talking about that East-West split. And of course, we as Orthodox have the understanding of, well, they left us. And of course, for Roman Catholics, they have the understanding we left them. And I know it can be more nuanced than that, but that's
Right, 'cause
what you run into.
yeah, in ecumenical conversations, we're with the Lutheran Church.
Mm.
So a big part of the division amongst Protestants and Western Roman Catholics is the argument about the episcopate and whether or not
Mhm.
that needs to be contiguous. And Lutherans are like, well, okay, maybe a little bit, so that we could get on with the Episcopals who are arguing that they're in line with the full apostolic succession. But
Yeah.
it's interesting that
Yeah.
both sides are using language for themselves, but the other side also uses it
Yeah.
for themselves.
So historical project, World Council of Church document, baptism, Eucharist ministry. Look at who wrote that. Who was key in that? It's a priest called Father George Florovsky. He was like very Orthodox, but he also, and this is kind of the interesting thing, very, very key in mid-century ecumenical movement. It's interesting. So,
We can associate also the word Orthodox with Holy Fathers. First century, the Holy Fathers developed a lot of teaching about the right faith.
yeah. So an interesting perspective is that for some, and this is probably more in the case of Protestants as opposed to Catholics, because we left the Catholics and they're they're the silo that everyone runs through. But for us, we will talk about understanding our faith as articulated by a council, or more specifically, a specific father, St. John Chrysostom, St. Basil. And the difference is, again, going to that propositional thing, is that if someone non-Orthodox might say, well, I read this thing that St. John Chrysostom that makes this point propositionally. So I like that book. I like St. John Chrysostom. For us, he's one of our fathers because he's part of that tradition. And so how we understand ourselves and our faith is because of that conversation that happened in our family back in the 4th century. So he's part of us, as it were, in that understanding. So it's a bit of a difference. So,
I also just looked up the etymology of Catholic, and Catholic is the Latin for Orthodox, so it was also just a linguistic.
so,
People were calling themselves.
and that's next week. So we'll look at that. Yeah, we're not Roman, but we are Catholic. So we'll look some at the word Catholic as well, and parse that out some. So we'll probably do a couple more.
Going back to the word Orthodox in Judaism,
Hmm.
because there is a particular branch of Judaic community that called Orthodox.
Yeah.
They're ultra-conservative.
Yes.
Not all, because they are also liberal.
Yeah. And so that's the thing is within Judaism, you do find a lot of diversity in terms of belief and practice. And so, yes, the word Orthodox applies to the very conservative, and that's where you typically see the things in terms of how they dress, how strictly they follow things in, the Torah and other teachings. Whereas there are other parts of Judaism where it's, well, that's part of where we came from, but they may articulate it as that's not central, and that there's a different way of understanding Judaism that's more permissive. Yes?
So when the Jews use Orthodox, are they talking about going all the way back to Second Temple Judaism, or the change that occurred after Christianity appeared?
Call a rabbi? I'm
Are they going back that far, or are they just saying, you know? Because there's a significant difference. I forget the term for the Jews after the temple was destroyed.
yeah.
When they reconstructed their.
Yeah, I think in general, and this is, I mean, I said ask a rabbi, but it is pointing at my deficits in the specifics there. But I think in general, all Judaism is post Second Temple. I know that I think there are some groups out there that have like a plan. So it's like, we'll go back, we'll build the temple, we'll re-equip it for sacrifices, we'll redo all the priestly vestments and all of that. But I don't think that's a majority view.
Talking about when they say Orthodox Jewish beliefs, they're probably talking post.
As I think, yeah, because I think the focus is still very much synagogue, which is looking at Scripture,
And
Hebrew
also
Scripture.
The commentary and study of the Scripture
Yeah.
over the centuries. They
Yeah.
have a whole system of books and the Talmud, and they debate and deliberate over that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I live in Beach.
So a good, this is reminding me, and again, this is a college experience. There's a Jewish author, Chaim Potok. He wrote a book called The Chosen, and it's about these two boys in Brooklyn who grew up together. One's an Orthodox Jew and one is not. And so it's about their friendship, and the whole thing is about kind of the context is the broader discussion within Judaism of establishing Israel as a state. And so it's the whole thing about what that means for different kinds of Jews. And so the one boy, and so this is like their teenage years and as they're growing up, the one boy, his dad is an Orthodox rabbi. And you know, the non-Orthodox boy is like, your dad's crazy, why does he treat you this way? And he's like, well, that's why we do things and how we do things. And it's kind of an interest, and it's an interesting exploration there. More college reading, so. Probably can do one or two more questions. Any more? Yes.
So as one of the Lutherans, I'm very thankful to be here learn tonight. When we look at the Protestant Bible compared to the Roman Catholic Bible, of course there are extra books
Mm-hmm.
that the Protestants wouldn't have. What would be the differences between your scriptures and the Roman Catholic Church?
Okay. Come to the third. So the thumbnail on that. The big thing is understanding. So this would be Protestant versus Catholic versus Orthodox, looking at the Old Testament and saying what is considered canon of the Old Testament. So, you know, more detailed conversation in a few weeks. But it's essentially saying that the understanding for Catholics and a little bit further for the Orthodox Church is that the canon is larger. And part of it is also the status. So sometimes you'll hear the term deuterocanonical, so second canon. So there's this sense that there are those additional books, but their status is somehow not as important as the other. For the Orthodox Church, we don't make that distinction. So what we see there, and I know there are nitpicky details in there, our canon is essentially, Old Testament canon would be essentially what you would see in the Roman Catholic canon. So what's different is that thing of priority, but also in terms of how it's organized. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. About 14, 15 years ago, here in North America, somebody finally published like a complete Orthodox Bible. It's the Orthodox Study Bible. So it's the Bible with notes, and of course with the Old Testament, the translation focuses more on the Greek text tradition, and it's in the order that is the traditional Orthodox order for the books in the Old Testament. So of course, all the way up to that time, and including going through seminary, the vast majority of Bibles that I used were Protestant, or maybe a Catholic one where they would take those deuterocanonical books and typically stick them in a separate part. It kind of threw me off because it's like, why is this here? And so it's an unfamiliar thing. So that's the short answer.
The first one that came out, the one you're speaking about, was just the New Testament, and it has a lot of notes in it.
Yeah.
Then they came out later with Old and New.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Than the other one. You almost have to have both of them.
Yeah.
To get a good grip. And also the numbering is different than some of the Psalms for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things, and I don't remember this, it's kind of this, I think you get to about Psalm 9 or 10, and then 2 Psalms are combined. So our numbering is off.
Yeah, it's off.
So Psalm 51 in everyone else's Bible is our Psalm 50.
Yeah.
And then later on, at some point, it switches back. So the last few Psalms are the same numbering again. So it's a little gymnastics there.
Good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I think that'll end the formal part. I'll probably hang around for a little bit, and we can visit informal if folks want to stick around, but I want to be respectful of time, and if folks need to take off, please do. As a reminder, we'll be back here 2 weeks from tonight, same time, 7, and it will be We're Not Roman, but We Are Catholic. So thank you again for coming out. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah.